Mr. President, I also rise on the floor together with my colleagues from New Mexico and Florida to talk about the refugee crisis at our nation's border. I appreciate Senator Heinrich's leadership on this issue and his comments, and I'm looking forward to hearing Senator Nelson as well. But I want to just share a little bit of a personal story and then amplify a few comments I made on the floor last Thursday about this challenge. I feel very personally connected to this issue and to the children who are coming to the border, children like Alejandro, whose picture was such a stark reminder that we're dealing with little kids. In 1980 and 81, I was a student in law school, and I decided I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, and I needed to figure it out. And so what I did was took a year off of law school and went to work with Jesuit missionaries in the town of El Progreso, Honduras. El Progreso, Honduras was at that point a small community at the edge of banana plantations in a large agricultural valley in that country. And I worked there as the principal of a school that taught kids to be welders and carpenters. I was dealing with youngsters in this neighborhood. Well, today El Progreso is in the epicenter of this problem. There have been hundreds of kids from El Progreso who've come to the border this year. San Pedro Sula, a nearby large city, is thought to be the murder capital of Honduras, which is now the murder capital of the world. When I was in Honduras in 1980 and 81, it was not an overly violent place. It was under a military dictatorship. There were problems and challenges. There was poverty. But refugees were coming into Honduras back then from El Salvador and Guatemala. They weren't leaving because there wasn't the everyday violence we see today. Honduras was a great ally of the United States, a great partner. Honduras was one of the original countries where we sent Peace Corps volunteers, and I could see their influence all around the country. But Honduras is a very different nation today. Honduras is now the murder capital of the world. Highest homicide rate in the United States, about 40 times the homicide rate of the United States. This area, El Progreso and San Pedro Sula, is really sort of the epicenter of that. The United States had to pull Peace Corps volunteers out of Honduras a few years ago because it got too violent. And the friends that I've stayed in touch with over the years have informed me about what's been happening in their neighborhoods as the violence has increased. We had a hearing last week where we had witnesses before us in the Foreign Relations Committee. We asked, why are the kids leaving Honduras? Is it because their parents don't love them? I mean, you think about family members. What would it take for a family to let a child take a trip of the kind that Alejandro took? It would have to be, I can tell you from living in Honduras, parents love their kids just like they do love them in the United States. They're no different. To send your child thousands of miles, you would only do it for the most extreme reasons, and living in the murder capital of the world is that extreme reason. These kids are fleeing to the border because they're not safe. What's the cause of the violence? I talked a little bit about this last week. The violence in Honduras, the murder capital of the world, El Salvador, 4th highest homicide rate in the world, Guatemala, 5th highest homicide rate in the world. The violence is driven overwhelmingly by the drug trade. That was the evidence before our committee hearing last week as well. Drug cartels have moved into Honduras and these Central American countries. They get drugs from South America. They're shipping them to the United States because of the U.S. demand for illegal drugs, especially cocaine. The drug trade in Honduras is not about Hondurans using drugs. Hondurans don't use drugs to any significant degree at all, but it is the illegal demand for drugs by people in the United States largely. And the dollars that we are sending essentially down to buy drugs that has turned Honduras, that has turned San Pedro Sula and El Progreso into a massive drug cartel area where the combination of dollars and violence and fights between drug cartels put little kids in harm's way. And then the gangs want them to join. We want to be the most powerful gang because we want the money. And the way we do that is we recruit more kids in. And so the roots of this problem, the roots of these refugees, these little kids who are coming to our nation, is violence in their neighborhoods that is created by a drug trade that is driven by, sadly, United States demand for illegal drugs. That's what's happening. That's what's happening. And it's just been heartbreaking to see a country that I care about and love and people that I care about and love live in a place that is now the murder capital of the world, largely because of the demand for illegal drugs that's coming from this nation. So what, we're going to blame these kids? We're going to call them name or stand out and protest against them? Why? Because they live in a violent neighborhood? Why? Because they want a better future? Why? Because they look at the United States and think we may be a better and safer place for them? We shouldn't be blaming them. We shouldn't be blaming them because they're doing what any of us would do if we lived in a neighborhood where the violence was this extreme. If you have no other way to protect yourself, you're going to leave. And we'd leave neighborhoods, and we'd leave situations that are this bad. Now, Mr. President, the good news is, and Senator Heinrich has laid this out, we don't have to stand by and say there's nothing we can do. There are solutions. And so we had a meeting with the 3 ambassadors today, and the Foreign Relations Committee is going to have a meeting with the 3 presidents of these nations tomorrow. And we're going to talk about solutions. And so let me just run through 6 things we can do. And I'll just talk briefly about some because my other colleagues have already dealt with them, or Senator Nelson will. But first, let's start off, how about just not blaming the kids for number 1? Let's just not blame the kids. Let's not pretend that they're crooks or criminals. Might there be some who are coming across the border that have criminal records? Sure. And we can do criminal record check and we can figure that out. And if that's the case, then we can deal with that. But these kids who are leaving to stay alive. My wife was a juvenile court judge. She used to say, I sometimes put a kid in jail to keep him alive. The need to remain alive sometimes leads you to do extreme things, even travel thousands of miles to come to a country where you think you might be more safe. Let's begin by not blaming these kids. That's number 1. Second, we do need to implement the law. Senator Heinrich talked about this law that was passed by a unanimous Congress, that was signed by President Bush, that was named after William Wilberforce. It's interesting. You know who William Wilberforce is? William Wilberforce was a great abolitionist English preacher who had interaction with the slave trade when he was in England, and then came to realize that the slave trade was wrong and that religions had promoted the slave trade, and he turned his life around and became a crusader against human trafficking, a crusader against the slave trade. That's what this law is that is put in place. Let's not willy-nilly change the law, let's implement the law. The law was a good law. In order to implement the law, we do need funding. And so Senator Heinrich talked about the supplemental request that will be before the Senate. We've had some good discussions about it. I think we've put it in a place where it's now solid. We do need to support that supplemental request so that there are ample services where these children can be evaluated. If they qualify for asylum, then they should be able to stay just like other refugees can stay. If they have committed criminal activities, they can be sent back in order to enforce the law. And it seems like that's what folks are always saying around here. We should enforce the immigration laws. Let's enforce the Wilberforce law and make sure that there's funds in place to do it. The third thing, Mr. President, we should do is we should get our priorities right about how we spend money. We're spending money the wrong way in Central America. I mean, it's just kind of amazing what we are doing. You would think that we ought to be investing a little bit in the security of Central America, just like we invest in rebuilding infrastructure in Afghanistan, just like we invest in things all around the world. And we should especially be doing it in Central America because it's the U.S. demand for illegal drugs that's creating the conditions of violence there. So doesn't that create some obligation to take a little bit of responsibility for helping Central American nations with security? Well, we do spend money on the security in Central American nations, but the money has been dwindling every year, dropping. In 2015, the President's budget submission for Central American Regional Security Initiative, $130 million, about $40 million each between the 3 countries. Compared to, here's what we spent on the border, on border security in 2015, $17 billion. $130 million for regional security in the nations where these refugees are coming from, and we're spending $17 billion on the border. Wouldn't it be better, instead of having to just catch all these kids as they're coming across the border and then spend time in expensive legal processes, wouldn't it be a little better to try to take some of that money and spend more in Central America to help these 3 nations have stronger police force, stronger judiciary systems? If we could deal with and reduce violence in the neighborhoods, and we have to do it in partnership with these nations, they have responsibilities as well. But if we could do that, we could dramatically reduce the number of kids that are coming to the border. But we're spending money the wrong way, and I'm happy that this supplemental has some significant funding to increase our security efforts in Central America. That's very critical. We've got to work with the Central American governments to prosecute the coyotes. The coyotes are the smugglers that bring these kids to the border. And they often perpetrate lies. They tell these kids, hey, look, if we can get you to the border, you can stay forever. They will spread false messages about American law. And they do it because they're making money off these poor families. Honduras is one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. For a parent to pay $4,000 or $5,000 to one of these smugglers for their kids to come, that is usually more than their combined assets. They have to gather up money from all kinds of places to be able to do it. We need to prosecute the coyotes, these smugglers in Central America, and our efforts can help the countries do that. We need to make sure that the countries spread the message that once the kids get here, they're not going to just be able to come in and stay automatically. That work is being done, but more can be done. But I do think, Mr. President, that probably the most important thing we could do here is this. It is to spend more money helping solve the cause, the violence, the drug cartels in Central America. And if we do that, we're going to see the numbers of kids who are having to flee neighborhoods like the ones I lived in dramatically reduce. A fourth thing we can do, and Senator Nelson's going to talk about this, so I don't really want to get into it, but is interdict more drugs. If you want to be tough, if you want to do something tough here, why send National Guard to the border? These kids aren't sneaking across the border. They're coming and turning themselves in to the first person they see. You have a U.S. uniform on. I know you won't kill me. I feel safe now. We don't need to send more National Guard to the border. The kids are already turning themselves in. But if you want to be tough, how about more funds for the American military? So they can interdict more drugs before they even get to Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And Senator Nelson will go into that. We do need to do immigration reform. Fifth, Senator Heinrich mentioned this. We passed immigration reform in this building in this chamber 13 months ago. There was all kinds of stories about it. In the House, there's been no action, not even bills out of committee, much less the House floor on immigration reform. The ambassadors this morning told us the uncertain status. Well, is there going to be immigration reform or isn't there? What's going to happen? Something passed, but maybe it's not going to pass in the other house. When there's uncertainty, that enables these coyotes to go in and kind of market, oh yeah, something's about to happen. This is going to happen. We can get you to the United States and you can stay. The faster we pass immigration reform, the sooner we create certainty, the easier it will be to deliver a message that all in Central America will understand about what our rules are and what they aren't, who is allowed to come in and who isn't. And finally, Mr. President, and this is the hardest one of all, we got to figure out strategies, better strategies to reduce illegal use of drugs, especially cocaine in the United States. Because as long as there is this massive, massive demand for illegal drugs like cocaine, in countries like Honduras that have really poor budgets, there's going to be these drug cartels that are very powerful that are going to use them as staging grounds to try to supply U.S. drug demand. You sometimes hear people talk about drug use, cocaine use as sort of a victimless crime. What's a victimless crime? I'm not hurting anybody. I may use drugs. I'm not hurting anybody. This is not a victimless crime. Somebody who's using recreationally illegal drugs that are transited through the Americas to get to them, they're creating victims. They're creating the murder capital of the world. They're creating kids who are having to leave their homes and flee thousands of miles to try to find safety in the arms of a Border Patrol agent on the border of the United States. And so we have to come up with new strategies to tackle what is a huge and overwhelming demand for illegal drugs in the United States. 2 weeks ago, the President's drug control policy administrator, key administrator, Michael Botticelli, went to Roanoke, Virginia to roll out the National Drug Control Strategy. Chose Roanoke because Virginia, like a lot of states, has had significant problems, whether it's with heroin or prescription drugs. But also chose Roanoke because Roanoke, Virginia has been a place where there's been strong efforts to come together and tackle illegal drug use. Last Friday, I went to Roanoke and I spoke at a drug court graduation. People who were addicted to drugs, but who had worked with social workers and folk in local courts to break the bonds of that addiction. The bonds that, just as they addict them, also put people in chains in countries like Honduras by turning their neighborhoods into violent drug-controlled shooting galleries. We have to be creative and strategic about dealing with this demand for illegal drugs because it is sad that these kids are fleeing here because of violence that in some ways has its root here. That drug demand right here in this country is at the origin of the violence that is chasing these kids out of their neighborhoods. And that gives us a moral responsibility to try to tackle this problem and solve it. So, Mr. President, I now yield the floor. I thank my colleagues for their strong support for the supplemental appropriation that we'll take up. And I look forward to working together. We can solve this problem. We can solve it if we do the right things.